How's everybody doing? For the people in the back, how's everybody doing? All right, cool. I don't usually do that, but everybody else was like jumping and dancing around for the last one, so it's like that's my best effort. I'm Tor. I'm the founder of Secret Foundation. We're one of the many entities that support Secret Network. Secret Network is a layer 1 with native privacy for smart contracts. We launched it on mainnet in September of 2020. So now we've been over a year with private smart contracts on mainnet. We're starting to see some of the critical use cases emerge. DeFi, NFTs, you name it. Super excited about like the Unlock presentation just now because we also believe that NFTs are the key to the future of the web, but only if data is actually protected in that entire process. So this talk is not about secret. It's about just the whole concept of privacy. It actually has a lot more to do with privacy than Web3, but the title of my talk is Web3 Privacy, Time to Stop Hiding. So without further ado, I'm going to start with the question that's probably on everybody's mind every minute of every day, like it is for me. What even is privacy? It's not very easy to answer this question satisfactorily unless you really just like don't care about your own privacy. Otherwise, like it is a really big question is like what actually is private anymore? Whether it's our actions, whether it's our thoughts, our beliefs, you know, our ownership, what is actually private anymore in the Web 2 world and now evolving into the Web 3 world. So whenever I try to define something, the first thing I do is I look for stock images of it, which I'm sure if any of you have ever made a presentation in this room, you do exactly the same thing. So I looked it up on Unsplash, and apparently this is privacy. Privacy is a bunch of surveillance cameras. Privacy is Facebook using binoculars. Privacy is a mailbox? I don't really know. But this is what privacy is if you ask the web. So I said, okay, well, I believe that privacy is a human right. So I then said, let's look up privacy human. So this is a privacy human. I don't know. Honestly, I think this is pretty cool. But it's not what I have in my head when I think of like a person who cares about their privacy. I just think about like me or anyone sitting in this room. Like we all have things that we care about keeping private, not because they're particularly nefarious, but just because that's part of our identity and it's part of our right as actual human people. So I'm very dissatisfied with the state of privacy stock images, but I'm more dissatisfied with the state of privacy on the web and now in the Web3 world. So I figured I would start, since I can't really define what privacy is, let's at least say what it's not. So privacy is not having something to hide. Privacy is not wanting to be alone. Privacy is not acting suspicious. Privacy is not dark colors. There's a reason I chose pink for this, other than it being like one of the like standard defaults. But it's like I don't like doing privacy talks and then putting everything in like black and gray and brown and whatever. Like privacy is supposed to be about what allows us to express identity, be ourselves. Most of us have things that are in our closet that aren't just black. I mean, like don't look at me right now. But generally speaking, I do have other things that say other things and like aren't just like this. Just when I come to ETH events, it's definitely this. So yeah, but maybe if we know that privacy is not these things, we can at least say this. Privacy is a human right, and it's part of what makes us as people deeply human. The ability to say something is mine and not somebody else's, but if I choose to share it with that person, maybe it becomes part of a shared identity together. And that's our choice as people. So I'm going to talk about the 3 pillars of privacy as I've come to understand it. And this is not like I feel I have the authority to define privacy or being human for anybody in this room, but I believe that privacy can be broken down into primarily 3 things, and I'll go through each of these pillars. First, privacy is about consent. Secondly, privacy is about freedom. And if you've heard both of those concepts before, there's a third one that I like to use that I don't really hear anybody else use, but I think it's so critical, especially when we talk and think about Web3, which is that privacy is also sustainability. And if it doesn't make any sense right now, I hope by the end of the presentation that it does start to make sense why there is such a big connection between the privacy of our systems and our privacy as people and the sustainability of our systems and the sustainability of the people within those systems. But we'll start with the first pillar, Privacy is consent. So even if we can't define privacy very well, we can start to define these pillars a little bit better. To me, consent means agreeing to what can be done with our information and then having knowledge of and being informed about this agreement. You can't really consent to something if you don't know what it is, and you can't really consent to something unless there's an agreement between you and whoever's asking you to do something about what the extent of that agreement actually is. The reason we don't necessarily understand privacy violations is because they're sort of invisible and they happen all the time, constantly around us in the Web2 world in a way that couldn't have been possible without the internet. But we kind of know when it's happening because violations of our privacy feel like oftentimes violations of our consent. It means something is happening. We did not consent to it. Something about ourselves was shared in a way that we did not agree to, and we feel that. But we don't necessarily feel it until we're confronted with the consequences of that violation of consent. So let's go back in time, all the way to 2018, a different era where we didn't wear masks but should have. So if you guys remember Cambridge Analytica, which now feels like a completely different millennium from now, but this was big news at the time that all of our Facebook data was being harvested. Ooh. Why are none of you surprised? This was really big news. So data was taken without authorization, profiles harvested, suddenly used for like targeted campaigns on democratic elections. It's like, this was a big deal. And now we're just like, yeah, of course they were doing that. Everybody was doing that. Equifax was doing that. Uber was doing that. Everybody was doing that. Why do we trust anyone? We shouldn't take this for granted, but we should be thinking about responsibility. So where does responsibility lie when something like this happens, right? Like, is it the platform? Is Facebook to blame? Is it like an individual application that leaked data on Facebook or maybe was abusing the terms of service? Is it the users? Stupid users. Why'd you sign those terms of service? What were you thinking? This is your fault. Is it the government because they didn't regulate Facebook enough? The problem is these systems are super, super complex, and we don't know where to assign accountability. We don't know how to enforce accountability, and we don't know who to blame. We just feel violated and confused. So there's an irony here. The privacy problem is also ultimately a transparency problem, because if we don't have transparency into the systems that are causing these violations to occur, we can't enforce accountability, and we can't identify accountable parties. So the question really becomes, again, about consent. How do you consent to something if you can't possibly understand it, if it's so opaque and so complex? And of course, the other question is, how do you regulate it? If the regulators can't understand it, which is, everything, and then how would you then, even if you could regulate it, how would you enforce accountability? How would you actually enforce any of these rules? The rules have to be super complex because the systems are super complex. But then you're asking someone somewhere in the system to enforce these complex rules when they don't understand the systems themselves and when the people are corruptible. So what happens? All right, fonts, come on. So this is, again, going back a little bit in time. But so Facebook asked to be regulated. Do people remember this? Where Facebook leaked everybody's data and then they were like, don't worry, we want to be regulated. And everybody was like, oh, wow, why would Facebook want to be regulated? That's so good of them. And then, but it seemed really obvious to, I guess, me and others at the time, which is like, Facebook had a very simple two-step plan. Step one, I'm just going to read it straight up. Grow to truly massive size, creating an incredibly complex and opaque system that creates huge negative externalities for billions of consumers, each with no visibility into the magnitude of the problems created. Right? Step two, profit. And it worked, and it continues to work. But they didn't stop at step two. There's actually another step. Step three, get caught being able to defend the misuse of user data. Step four, use the profits to influence governments, claiming only you can understand the problem that you created. And step five, create rules that only you can follow and crush all other competition. That's regulatory capture. This works really well in the Web2 world. We call it innovation, I guess, for some reason. I don't think regulatory capture is terribly innovative. I think we've been doing it forever. I don't like it, but it is good business. Fortunately, after this, as we all know, Facebook kind of stepped back into the shadows, fixed a lot of their internal systems for privacy, and has been a good corporate citizen ever since. Oh, shit. Sorry. I had to add a slide at the last minute because of how dumb this is. Look at this guy handing you the metaverse. But if you look at it, it actually looks like he's about to like absorb the metaverse from you, which is basically what he's trying to do. So don't let him do it. I tweeted about it. Please don't let him absorb your metaverse. It's ours. So just to recap, we don't often feel privacy violations, but we do feel the violations of our consent. And when I look at that picture of Zuck, I do feel violated. But I also think about the ways in which Facebook has become a huge violation of our privacy, and yet we've allowed it to permeate every aspect of our democracies, of our culture, of our political institutions, of the very fabric of the internet. When you like something anywhere on the internet and it all goes back to Zuck's phone, that's not cool. It's a violation of privacy and consent, and we shouldn't have to wait until the data leaks to feel it and to feel like we need to build something better. That brings me to the second pillar, which is privacy as freedom. So now we're going to get into a little bit of like the misconceptions about privacy as being something that like, you know, this is hiding in the dark, you know, that's privacy. This is like wearing a hoodie, that's privacy. So I went to people who I thought would know better than me because they named their entire thing after privacy, which is Privacy International. And they express it really beautifully, that this is two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, you have the right to privacy, and on the other hand, you have the right to freedom of expression. Because we do have the right to maintain a private life and private communications. And usually when we have mass surveillance, it's not to make sure that criminals aren't doing anything wrong just because the government doesn't happen to be looking at them. What it means is that they're really being used for suppression, and suppression of speech, suppression of expression. And platforms and governments work in tandem for this suppression. Platforms because they gain something from being able to control these systems, and governments because they gain stability and power from being able to control these systems. And surveillance ultimately is control. So even though governments might be saying, oh, we have freedom in the US, and we're told to express ourselves freely, and we're told to be in the freest country in the world, we're not protected from the consequences of that freedom of expression if we do not have our privacy. So freedom means the power and right to act and speak and think as one desires, and it's the pursuit of happiness. We maybe can't guarantee you're going to achieve it. That's very much like an internal journey, but you certainly have the right to pursue it, and you shouldn't be suppressed in that expression of your own freedom and your own pursuit of identity. So not only is privacy essential to individual freedoms and that pursuit of identity, it's also essential to the pursuit of collective identity and collective freedoms. So here's another quote. States tell us that stability cannot be ensured if anonymous online expression is unregulated, that communications must be visible by the state in order to prevent terrorism and cybercrime, that interactivity without observability would lead to illegality. And all of these are false choices. It's another irony that expressing our right to privacy means expressing our freedom to speak publicly. Our right to having a private identity and a self-defined sense of identity allows us our freedom to speak publicly. And that freedom needs to be enforced by the systems that we create. Otherwise, we haven't created a freer system if it's more surveilled. That seems to be that freedom needs to be on the same side of the coin as maintaining our own privacy. And the questions that we ask ourselves, right? Like, these are all things, what websites you visit, the books you read, the items you buy, who you speak to, who you fall in love with, where we ask ourselves, okay, well, what would they do if they knew and they wanted to do something about it? They already know all this stuff. Facebook already knows all this stuff. You know, like we already tell Facebook literally everything, and we didn't understand the consequences of that until it was too late, and it was everywhere, but they knew. So the question to me isn't what would they do if they knew. The question is, what could happen next? And this is an old article. I reused some of these slides, full disclosure, but this is an old article about like CBDCs. And if you look at CBDCs in a country like China, I don't really have to spend too much time explaining why that could be used to crush any form of dissent against a centralized government. But maybe I have to stress how easily this could happen in the Western world as well. that these can just as easily be used as tools of oppression without any type of privacy baked into the system. So if you care about freedom and you care about open economies, really you should care about your privacy. But now we're getting to the last pillar, the one that I don't hear talked about as much, but I think is really essential for understanding why privacy is something that's an ongoing concern, which is privacy as sustainability. And my definition of sustainability is not always about, nature, but to me it means creating systems that can maintain their balance instead of requiring things to grow insatiably for all time. Things that can actually find some sort of stable state and empower the people within those systems without needing to voraciously acquire every resource in sight. And it means increasing the resilience of the systems that we already depend on instead of making them even more voracious. Because fundamentally, systems that can't provide privacy are unsustainable for the people who need to inhabit them. And what matters is the people in the systems more than the systems. And we've created a bunch of systems with Web2 that interconnect to each other endlessly, that create massive attack surfaces, that exploit privacy for private gain. That is not sustainable for the people within those systems. And that's why Web3 has become such an inevitable revolution. It was inevitable that we would want to capture some of the value from these systems. So one more quote. This one's vaguely famous. Who's heard this quote before? Information wants to be free. You can do hands. You can get up and dance around if you're feeling like in that stretchy mood again. Okay. Did you know that there's a second half to this one? Did you know that there's more to this quote? No, that's not the rest of the quote, but I pose to you, or does it? Actually, the rest of the quote is, information wants to be free. Information also wants to be expensive because it's so valuable. So information wants to be free in the sense that the cost of acquiring data is decreasing dramatically. So that marginal cost of data acquisition is verging on zero. And even creating new data, right? We sort of do it passively all the time. There's not this massive cost to creating the data. So information wants to be free. It's so cheap to produce. Except that the value of the data simultaneously is increasing dramatically because it allows you to understand and create systems and then subsequently control the people who are generating that data. And this gap between information wanting to be cheap because it's cheap to produce and the information wanting to be expensive because it's so deeply valuable, information about our identity, about our financial practices, everything else, right? That gap, that surplus, that gets captured by Facebook. And then they get fined 0.01% of the value of that gap. And in Web2 world, the people who create that data, even passively, capture basically 0% of the value. Fortunately, we've solved this in Web3. There are no more privacy issues in Web3, so we can all go home and sleep easy because this fundamental issue of information online has been solved. No. But good news is we can still raise money for funding platforms that extract all the data on the blockchain, because blockchains leak all of your data by default. You don't have to wait for Cambridge Analytica to do it. You don't have to wait for some sort of massive speculative attack. It just happens by default all of the time. You're constantly tweeting your bank account. You're constantly doxing your NFTs. Everything you're doing on a public blockchain is already being captured by companies that are now about to exploit the difference between the zero marginal cost of producing that data and the vast amounts of money they can get from then going and turning around and licensing their services to governments, platforms, you name it. Or eventually, I'm not going to go all the way back to the slide where Zuck's doing this to you, but eventually, yes, that's where it goes. So information wants to be free, information wants to be expensive, but the rest of the quote, the very last piece of the quote is, it is really the people who want to be free. So we always have this tension. I looked up a stock image for tension, you're welcome. We always have this tension between information wanting to be free, information want to be expensive. And the people who enforce the systems that are constantly extracting that value between the cheap data to produce and the value of that data, those people spend an awful lot of resources keeping those systems intact, including Facebook begging governments to regulate them. All that lobbying effort costs a lot of money. Keeping the servers online costs a lot of money. Rebranding as Meta costs a lot of money. So I guess Facebook is kind of sustainable because they're putting a ton of energy into doing it, and it seems to be working. They're going to hire 10,000 people in Europe to build the metaverse, so you're all out of a job. But unsustainable does not refer to a system that can't be sustained under any circumstances. Clearly, they're sustaining it. What it means is that it's incredibly energy intensive to maintain that system. So why would you do that when the rewards are too valuable to ignore? And Web 2 world is going to continue expending a massive amount of resources to keep the systems exactly the way that they are, because they derive such a tremendous benefit from, keeping the boot on the throat of the web. So if data is the new oil, and again, data, oil, first Google hit. If data is the new oil, then you can immediately see the parallels between these companies in the Web 2 world and oil companies in the Web 2 world, where there's these tremendous negative externalities being created. We're creating entirely unsustainable systems that are collapsing, and the cost is not borne by the organizations. The cost is borne by the end users. So to extend the analogy to its natural conclusion, we have been destroying the economic environment for the humans who must live in it, let alone the regular environment. And that's had consequences. But fortunately, people in this room understand that there is an alternative to these systems. We're building these alternative systems. All I'm stressing is that as we build these systems, you have to keep Web3 privacy in mind, not because, we want to avoid taxes, but because consent, freedom, sustainability. These are three things that every person in this room should fundamentally care about. And once you understand that when you care about those three things, you're already a privacy advocate, even if you don't know it yet. But these are the pillars that make up that core belief around privacy as a human right. And fundamentally, when it comes to defining privacy, it's not one thing. It is everything. But I'm just a guy standing on a stage wearing a privacy hat. So I'm a little biased. But at the same time, if any of this spoke to you, or if you want to build using our technologies, or you're a Web3 creator and you're thinking, what could native privacy do for my NFTs, do for my DeFi protocol, do for anything that I'm trying to build in a more permissionless world, I assure you that privacy should be at the forefront of your mind. So come talk to me. You can help us defend Web3 privacy. I threw up some links. That's my Twitter up top. You can go to the website. You can follow us on Twitter. You can join our Discord. Or the last thing is you can become a secret agent. It's super cool to say. And go to this website. It'll show you how to sign up. You just put in your email. We protect it with our lives. But then we'll send you your first mission. So thanks, everybody, for listening to me. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and I hope to talk to you soon.